And why don't British sci-fi films make it big at the box office? Is it lack of cash or too much scepticism? The idiosyncratic world of Planet UK, examined now on BBC4 by The Cinema Show.
As you enter the unexplored galaxy of British science fiction cinema, we must warn you of the dangers that lie ahead.
I'm expecting to see a pub.
Heavy and possibly dangerous cosmic rays could have reached the Earth's surface and may have affected many people in strange ways.
A dominatrix from Mars and a robot that looks like a fridge on legs.
The world's been invaded. And a cup of tea will save everything.
Come on, Jamie, while we're still alive, we might as well have a cup of tea.
From Quatermass and the Pit to Village of the Damned, Britain has produced some science fiction movie classics. But much of our contribution to the genre is trapped in a little-known lost world.
Science fiction, because it involves sometimes the fantastic, sometimes the implausible, the projection of futurist scenarios, doesn't quite fit into that critical idea of what good cinema and good culture is.
One of the reasons why these films are perhaps not taken seriously by many people is that most of them are cheap. So a lot of British science fiction films tend just to get pushed to one side. Which is unfortunate, because a lot of them are quite distinctive in their own right.
Oh, Doctor, I'm glad to see you're here. This man's become a raving lunatic.
Hey, what's going on out there?
The thing you expect is terrible acting, usually black and white, usually terrible special effects. But often as not, there's something about the script that jumps out at you, something that will stay with you for a while after you've watched it.
They tend to be obscure, but turn on the Trollenberg Terror one night on TV, or Devil Girl from Mars, or The Earth Dies Screaming, or Night of the Big Heat, and you're guaranteed some kind of really strange surprises.
Unlike those films to come, Britain's first major expedition into sci-fi territory was a big-budget visual spectacle, Things to Come, based on the speculative writings of H.G. Wells.
He had amazing foresight in many ways. He kind of really did sort of predict how the role of the bombing would have in the Second World War, like about 10 years beforehand when he wrote Things to Come. And there in the first third of the film, there it is. And you look at it and go, yeah, that's kind of how it happened.
The film then goes on, and we see the emergence of a futuristic, modern, technological society, making great technological advances to the extent that by the mid-21st century, the human race is ready to send its first rocket to the moon.
Will they come back? Yes, and go again and again, till the landing is made and the moon is conquered.
I remember the acting being a bit sort of 30s and wooden, but, you know, the flying planes and the huge sort of spaceships and stuff, that I remember thinking that was absolutely fantastic.
The film ends with this sequence in which scientists have flown in on their airplanes and restored order to the world in this frankly rather fascistic manner.
Our job is only beginning. For now, we have to put the world in order. It will be a long and complicated struggle, but we have the unity of a common order and a common knowledge.
The thing about Wells is he has a Victorian attitude to science and technology, which is basically very positive, and he thinks that science will solve all our problems for us. And the 20th century experience, the kind of post-Victorian experience, hasn't really borne that out.
You look back to the Victorian era and people associated science with steam trains and with bridges and positive things. And then I think that it changed when the atomic bomb was set off, and unfortunately for scientists, it was a negative reaction.
Dr. Royston, isn't it?
Mr. Harding, how?
There's nothing you can say will help. I know about you, Dr. Royston. You're a scientist, not a doctor. You don't look after the sick. You meddle with things that kill, like they killed my boy in there. You should be locked up, Royston. Locked up with others like you, letting off bombs you can't control. You're not safe.
You wouldn't say in 1950 looking at an H-bomb test, probably, oh, cheers, scientists, good, I feel safer now. You'd go, hang on, stop all this.
Fiend Without a Face, which is a marvellous film about flying invisible brains that suck people's skulls empty. For quite a lot of that film, you think it's to do with a nuclear power plant or an Air Force base that's around. In fact, it's not. It turns out to be our old favourite mad scientist who's tinkering with things that man should leave alone. But the end result of that is a particularly repulsive attack by flying brains with tentacles.
I think particularly in the 50s, in the nuclear age, the scientist is a profoundly ambiguous figure, because on the one hand, he's a figure who has the potential to destroy everything through meddling with things that he shouldn't. But on the other hand, he has the potential to save us. And Quatermass is an interesting figure in that respect, because he combines both elements.
You've done this to him. He'd have been better off if he'd been killed or stayed out there.
Judith.
You've destroyed him like you've destroyed everything else you've touched.
Destroyed him, I've brought him back, I've saved him.
Saved him for what? For further experiments? I can help him more than you or anyone else can.
There's no room for personal feelings in science.
Originally made by the BBC, the Quatermass stories were remade for the big screen by Hammer Films, who, with an eye to the US market, cast an American in the title role.
Do you realize what you'll have to face if this turns out to be a disaster, Quatermass?
How much further?
Well, 50 miles. I'm talking to you.
For the last 20 miles, I've been painfully aware of that.
The character of Quatermass, through all three incarnations of the original TV shows, was a very sort of principled, very ethical scientist. When Val Guest recast him in the first two Hammer movies, Brian Donlevy portrayed him in a much more bullish sort of way.
Don't try and drag me through the mud, Blake. You might splash a little bit on yourself, you and your committee.
You deliberately launched that rocket without waiting for official sanction.
If the whole world waited for official sanction, it'd be standing still.
Quatermass achieves this great success in launching the first British manned rocket, but it turns out that it comes into contact with an alien organism.
An important taboo has been breached. You know, they've gone beyond the boundaries of Earth, and some weird infection has entered the body of the astronaut, who, when you first see him, appears to be sort of traumatised and shell-shocked. But fairly soon, it's clear something alien has transformed his body.
Look at the contour of the face.
You mean the bone structure?
Yes, I could be wrong about a limb, but not about the shape of the bones. There's been a change. I'm convinced of that.
What's so effective about Quatermass is there is actual pathos in the way that the astronaut is portrayed. He's aware that he's becoming monstrous and staggering around London and turning into a kind of cactus before he becomes an out-and-out threat and has to be destroyed.
Is it something to do with your arm? Well, look, I'll just take a look. I won't hurt it, I promise.
But there is this blurring, particularly with the Quatermass movies, between science fiction and horror. You have references to the old Frankenstein in that scene where the astronaut meets the little girl.
Go on, Dolly. You ask him. Please, won't you have tea and cakes with us? Don't be frightened.
The success of the Quatermass experiment in cinema did lead to Hammer focusing on horror, and particularly on their first major horror success, which was The Curse of Frankenstein, which is about another irresponsible scientist whose actions lead to terrible consequences.
Sometimes it takes a visitor from beyond the stars to point out the dangers of our scientific meddling.
Our craft used the planetary lines of magnetic attraction as their means of propulsion. That's why we were so concerned with your experiments. Alarmed, I might say. We had to act in what you would call enlightened self-interest.
The alien in the strange world of Planet X doesn't bring a threat at all. He's actually coming here to tell us, you guys are messing up with your bad science.
I am not an inhabitant of your planet. I have come from another planet. A planet you call Venus.
In Stranger from Venus, the alien comes to Earth to save humans from their own folly. Humans can't be allowed to govern their own destiny, that there are things man is not meant to know, and it's the job of the universe to stop them knowing that.
We've been amazed and amused at your behavior. Your fumbling attempts to solve your national and international problems remind us of our own early history. We haven't found the answers to all our problems yet.
Those are the kind of aliens who look down on us a bit. I mean, they're rather unpleasant and smug. I suppose Mr. Spock is one of those too, who seem to come basically to lecture us about how wrong we are and how we shouldn't be developing nuclear weapons. They may have a point.
Indeed, when British sci-fi mixes mad scientists with nuclear technology, we're really in trouble.
Say as you fool. Get away from there!
It's very much, well, I don't know about that radiation experiment. It's broken the telly. It's all that.
In Joseph Losey's The Damned, such radiation experiments are taken to a chilling extreme.
The Damned is one of the great undiscovered classics of British science fiction cinema. It's about a series of children who are irradiated before birth. And there you see some of the key themes of British science fiction cinema. Fear of generational conflict, fear of bureaucracy, fear of the welfare state, fear of scientists doing mad things behind the scenes.
Why are you doing this? What's it all for? What are you trying to make out of these children?
A scientist is trying to breed children who can survive a nuclear war. Because the children are radioactive, they can have no direct human contact. And a sense that in order to create children who will survive, create a humanity that will survive, we have to abandon humanity as a value.
The idea that you have of these children who are radioactive and threatening through no fault of their own is this sense of that we're all doomed because the children embody the future, and if there's something wrong with the children, then there's not much hope for any of us.
Holy smoke! Look at that! It's an eclipse. That certainly wasn't in the schedule.
Nuclear experiments on a larger scale feature in The Day the Earth Caught Fire, where a journalist investigates early evidence of global warming.
One of the great fears that Britain has in the 1950s is that it's no longer a great power. And you see that in The Day the Earth Caught Fire, for example, where Britain becomes a victim of what the real superpowers, America and Russia, are up to.
They say that those two bangs did more than alter the tilt. They made an 11-degree shift in our orbit. And we're moving towards the sun.
It's quite a good film. An exceptionally bad piece of science. There's several atomic bombs which apparently knock the Earth off its axis so that it's tilting at a different angle.
Could happen.
No one notices this for weeks.
I'm not up on my sci-fi, so we're orbiting towards the sun. Well, how many billion light years...
If that's true, I'd say there's about 4 months.
Before what?
Before there's a delightful smell in the universe of charcoaled mankind.
Some of the images in it were very stark and very shocking. The Thames drying up in London and people walking around looking for water to drink, and sort of images of fields parched dry with dead cows in. And I grew up in the countryside, so it somehow struck a chord. And also, certainly the big fear at that period of nuclear war, which I definitely had dreams about. And it kind of chimed in with that.
Well, it just shows you what the sun brings out. Quite a day to jump in the pool, isn't it? Made any good connections lately?
Please, this is my day off.
What's curious about the film is that the heat in the city has the effect of increasing the heat in the male protagonist, who seems to get more and more inflamed as the film goes on.
It's as if the heat unleashes all those emotions that are normally repressed. In both The Day the Earth Caught Fire and Night of the Big Heat, characters suddenly become more overtly sexual, and they express their emotions more clearly, and it's as if they are losing their Britishness bit by bit as the sun burns into them.
It's probably only in Britain that the end of the world would be signified by having good weather for a change. A writer who's had an affair flees the mainland to an island where there's a freak heat wave as part of an alien invasion starting off, to escape an affair he had with a younger woman. She follows him to this island to take on the job of his secretary. And Jane Merrow, who plays this character in wonderful over-the-top style, she's constantly perspiring. She has a wonderful scene where she rubs ice cubes all over her cleavage whilst taunting the man's wife.
What happened to Mr. Callum's last secretary? Did she get lonely? Is that why she left?
There is a lot of overheating in British science fiction, and it's often to do with the appearance of aliens, or indeed Earthwomen, in bikinis.
The latest in swimwear seems to inflame the aliens too, but fortunately, as they finally attack, there's a welcome break in the weather.
Look! The rain! It's killing them!
The way in which the alien invasion is defeated is, again, it seems to be typically British. It rains, and these red-hot aliens just kind of die.
Of course, most aliens head straight for America, where the fears of invasion are very different to ours.
They're getting ready to take off. Blair, set up demolition charges enough to blow this thing right back to Mars.
The American alien invasion or mutant attack film of the 1950s, they look to the future. They're all about communists. The average Martian in an American movie comes from a red planet. Whereas British invasion films seem to be looking back. They're much more to do with World War II. I think the most obvious one is Daleks Invasion Earth, where very clearly the Daleks are Nazis from outer space rather than commies from outer space.
In the Doctor Who and the Daleks movie, you've certainly got the Thals, who the Daleks are trying to just eradicate, and it ain't difficult, 20 years after the fact to see some similarities with the Holocaust there.
This is the final battle. When we explode the neutron bomb, destroy the Thals!
And from Nazi Daleks, we get the Middle England Hitler Youth in the film adaptation of John Wyndham's The Midwich Cuckoos.
One of my very favourite films of British science fiction is Village of the Damned. A powerful, haunting film about alien children being born in this English village of Midwich and developing these telepathic powers. If you read the original novel, the children are characterised almost as Semitic, actually. They've got long, narrow noses and dark hair and dark skin and golden eyes. And changing that in the film to make them these sort of Aryan children, like the Von Trapp family or something, is a stroke of genius. It touches all those anxieties that the Second World War had set off that still kind of resonate.
The children in that film, one of the ways that they made them scary, apparently, was just to tell them to stand still. That was it. Because children just don't stand still. So if you get 6 kids all standing stock still, suddenly it's terrifying.
Just how deep do you see into my mind?
Everything that's in the front of your mind.
The thought processes? The reasoning that leads to my spoken words?
We still have to master that.
George Sanders plays an utterly reasonable man, but he alone realises what threat they represent and takes upon himself to destroy them.
You're not thinking of atomic energy. You're thinking of a brick wall.
Brick wall. The professor goes in with a suitcase with a bomb in it and distracts the children by thinking of a brick wall so they can't read his mind, know what he's about to do, and then the film ends with the explosion.
British sci-fi of the period not only reflected anxieties about the war, but harkened back to wartime values that were fast disappearing.
Hard as it might be to believe, the 50s is full of nostalgia for World War II, or rather for, if you like, a kind of memory of what it was like to be part of a broader collective, a sense of a kind of social unity. And a number of science fiction films make a reference back to World War II. The Quatermass films in particular, Quatermass and the Pit, the attack on London towards the end is like the Blitz.
In Hammer's third Quatermass outing, Andrew Keir takes the title role and, understandably, has difficulty convincing the authorities he's discovered a prehistoric alien spaceship.
I told you I had an explanation. The Germans in 1944.
Oh, Breen, you can't still be hanging on to that.
Professor Quatermass, you are an expert in certain fields, I in others. One of my specializations is weapons, and another military propaganda, so kindly allow me my opinion without interrupting.
The obnoxious army officer puts forward a theory that the alien spaceship is actually a Nazi secret weapon that the Jerrys dropped in 1945 and has not yet been decoded.
The demons. It's all right. They're dead. They've been dead for a long time.
It's about characters discovering an invasion that took place millions of years previously, when Martians came to Earth and intervened into the early evolutionary history of mankind and changed mankind so that it resembled Martians. And as one character in the story comments, that means we are the Martians now. It's a story of complete defeat.
You realize what you're implying? That we owe our human condition here to the intervention of insects.
What's interesting is the sequence where the heroine, under a sort of hypnosis, makes clear to the viewers that she is one of them. But what makes the film more bleak is that it shows that the enemy is contained within society. It can't be erased because half the population are aliens.
Thankfully, a full-scale alien attack is the exception rather than the rule in British science fiction.
Why bother to invade Britain in the 50s and 60s? You know, you can understand why you would want to invade America, it's the world power, but Britain's not like that. And as you move into the 60s, aliens start arriving more or less by accident. For example, a film called Invasion, where the aliens are just passing through.
Why have you come here?
We were on our way to another planet. Our ship broke down. 2 prisoners escaped. I was looking for them.
When Britain is invaded in alien films in the 1950s and 60s, such as Earth Lies Screaming, they tend to be just a handful of aliens who come down, usually to some unlikely location like the Highlands of Scotland or some way out hotel in the sticks.
Now, of course, the real reasons behind this were usually budgetary and so on. It was a lot cheaper to film there. But it does give the films, I think, a certain quaintness and perhaps a certain strangeness and otherliness about them that certainly differentiates them from the bigger budget Hollywood productions that are being made around the same time.
Are we eating soon?
It'll be ready in a minute. I just want to feed the chickens first.
I suppose there's always a contrast between folksiness, the familiar, the homey, and the strange aberration, the thing that crops up, the rampaging mutant or whatever. In order to be scary, it has to be contrasted with normality.
Well, let's all have a drink on me.
No, this time it's on the house. It's not every day we have a distinguished professor from London, a writer for the newspapers, and a right bonny lassie staying with us. Drinks on the house!
There is a whole subgenre of British science fiction films that take place in pubs. And there you have an alien presence of some sort, which is mostly dealt with by a bunch of people who go drinking.
You need to see some sort of
there
pub.
There must be a pub, and there must be a scene when they're going, well, I don't know about these spores, but I hope it doesn't affect the beer.
The pub is a place where you can get a microcosm of British society and the fantasy of if the worst happens, then the working class and the middle class and the upper class can get together in one place and fend off the enemy.
You're kidding yourself, Nolan. What happened earlier this morning, that was no accident. Whoever did it has won the war. All they've got to do is to move in and take over. And then it's every man for himself.
Of course, what many of the science fiction films really fret about from the 50s onwards is that that isn't going to happen.
Again, Quatermass and the Pit is very clear on this. You have a mob. You have this faceless crowd who are irrational and violent and cannot be controlled, and there's a sense that the community is no longer tenable. There are all sorts of anxieties about what Britain is becoming as it becomes more materialistic, more affluent, but also as its status as a world power visibly declines. And those anxieties clearly register in a lot of films generally, but science fiction films particularly.
British science fiction would have us believe the greatest threat to 50s Britain was the new independent woman.
In immediate post-war films, such as The Perfect Woman and Four-Sided Triangle, we have narratives which are about men trying to control women, to control their minds, to control their bodies, and so forth. And this is perhaps a direct response to the social changes which had taken place during the Second World War.
In The Perfect Woman, a scientist attempts to create a compliant female robot, while in Four-Sided Triangle, we see an early attempt at cloning.
Four-Sided Triangle is about somebody whose girlfriend leaves him for his best mate and so wants to recreate her with the single difference that she'll like him more than the other bloke. Neither of those experiments work out particularly well. I mean, there's a sense that the woman is recalcitrant, and will not be remade in the to suit the whims of man.
Speed 970 miles per hour.
970.
Acceleration 6G.
The new independent woman is most obviously represented in these films as the female scientist, but she's also a source of anxiety. In, for example, The Strange World of Planet X, the female scientist there is introduced by a discussion between the male scientists about what they expect a female scientist to be like.
Woman, this is preposterous. This is highly skilled work. She's very highly qualified, Doctor.
Yeah, I know the type. Frustrated, angular spinster.
Guess what you've got as an assistant? A woman. A woman? I'm not having that.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was told to come down here.
When she walks in, he's met by this beautiful model-like French woman with this kind of exotic accent, and he can't believe it's her. And of course, right away, he's making his moves on her.
You're French, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Are you surprised?
Very agreeably so.
Thank you.
Oh, she's pretty. Oh.
And she's French. And then she can be intelligent.
I see you have 9 circuits in operation here, and only 1 in reserve. Is that not rather dangerous?
But she can also be quite kind of soft.
Yeah.
And caring.
I enjoyed that.
I mean, imagine a lot of people watching these kind of science fiction films have never seen a woman before.
Well, certainly not one like this. In Devil Girl from Mars, women are most definitely alien.
Devil Girl from Mars is one of the great sort of British cult films in which a completely fetishised alien woman comes down, covered head to toe in black leather, and terrorises a series of men. And she really seems to sum up male fears of women at that period. She's an object of horror, but eroticised horror as well. Fear and fascination are combined in her.
My name is Naya.
Where do you come from?
Mars.
But that's preposterous.
You men on Earth are much as we expected.
I mean, she looks like a lesbian dominatrix, which in the 1950s probably was a devil, really. And all she's coming to Earth for is men's sperm.
So you come here for new blood?
In a way.
I think there's a lot of things going on in that film. I can't be sure because I was really very distracted by Patricia Latham in her all-in-one leather catsuit. It's very difficult to remember anything else about that film apart from that.
Meanwhile, I will select some of your strongest men to return with me to Mars.
And if they don't want to go with you?
There is no if.
It seems to be a matriarchal society that's entirely based on abducting men. You have a sense that maybe if the Devil Girl asked for volunteers, she wouldn't actually go short.
In The Nightcaller, scientists find a male alien is abducting women, but it soon becomes clear who poses the real threat.
Nightcrawler is a good example of a film that seems to be very scared of women, and particularly women who are very sexual. So in the film, an alien comes to Earth and performs what seem to be genetic experiments on women, whom he lures to Soho. But what really seems to be happening is they're paying the price for their increasingly permissive sexuality.
The alien who's come to London abducts women by advertising in a magazine called Bikini Girl for women who want to become models. The female scientist poses as one of these girls going undercover as a model. She's both smart and beautiful, and this is a combination the alien itself cannot cope with.
You have no need to fear me.
On the contrary, I fear what I cannot control. And I cannot control an intelligence that is almost equal to mine. A mind such as yours searches and destroys.
The beautiful girls can be taken away and not pose any threat, but the smart girls are something the aliens and something men more generally just find incomprehensible and must distance themselves from, separate themselves from as violently as they need to.
But by the late 1960s, British sci-fi was more ready to embrace the new, permissive society.
Zeta 1 is a satirical sex comedy. It also represents its age in the sense that it's got a lot of permissiveness in it, got a fair amount of nudity, fetishistic clothing again. And it's a wonderfully camp and bizarre and just generally strange film.
So, you are Edwina. Lachesis, show our guest the colony.
The funny thing about it is that the colony, headed by this woman called Zeta, who's supposed to be this all-powerful woman on some parallel plane, it's supposed to be a colony of empowered women, but all they seem to do is wear not very much in the way of clothing and wrestle each other. So frankly, if you ask me, that's just a man's wet dream.
I think once you get to the late 60s, the image of women in the science fiction genre does change dramatically. They're more there in order to be looked at, to give visual pleasure, and you also see them enjoying themselves. So I think the issue of femininity is no longer presented to the audience as something problematical.
As the new generation began changing the face of Britain in the late 1960s, a film made here in the UK was about to dramatically alter the science fiction landscape.
"2001 is a major landmark and a watershed in the representation of science fiction in cinema. It's really the first time since Things to Come that science fiction is done on a really big scale, a larger budget, very elaborate visual effects. It's also a major director, Stanley Kubrick, who has a status as an auteur. He's not just a genre hack and so on.
Although Kubrick was American, he'd lived and worked in the UK for several years and collaborated with British writer Arthur C. Clarke on his space epic.
It's quite long. When I first saw 2001, I was 13, and at the beginning of the film, I didn't have chicken pox. And at the end of the film, I was completely covered.
Right.
It does look, it still looks amazing. Well, no one's ever going to do that again because no one's going to have the money to make those sets, because you have to make sets on a computer now. If you make sets that big,
well, the one which rotates. Who's going to do that again?
No one's going to do that again.
That footage of the guy jogging around the spaceship is just breathtaking still now. I mean, the science made sense to someone who didn't really understand much about space travel. If you spin someone round in the inside of a ring, they won't float. They'll have gravity. You can kind of understand how it works.
The thing that scientists like about 2001 is its beautiful accuracy in many respects. The representation of space, I think, actually stands up today. They got everything right, you know, the rotating space station and the artificial gravity and the way you got to the moon. And you have to remember, this was before the Apollo astronauts landed on the moon.
I think it is a film about alienation and about human relations to the science and technology that is all around us. And Hal, although he doesn't appear physically in the film, he's just that red camera eye. He's such a great character.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
That kind of fear of a machine that then gets a bit moody and takes over for reasons that then are buried deep in its brain, are really clever and really chilling, and I mean very well done in that particular movie.
Daisy, give me your answer, do.
You know, he's a murderer. He's just killed 4 people. You've got to turn him off. It's him or you. You're still going, he's saying about bicycle.
It's an amazing bit, though. It's an amazing piece of cinema when they turn off Hal.
The film's tagline was the best trip you'll ever take. So it was kind of buying into that whole drug culture that was going on at that point.
The first time I saw it, I just sat at the end going, you know, I did not get it, and would have been stoned out my tits. I mean, I wouldn't have known what was going on. But it didn't do it. I didn't get it. I didn't go, oh yeah, man, like the ending. I mean, the ending was loads of colours that went on too long, gave me a bit of a headache, and then he was in a bedroom with a fetus, and I went, oh, I don't know. And obviously the transition from bone to spaceship. When you're 18 and... well, man, the bones become a spaceship.
By courting the counterculture audience and anticipating the moon landings, 2001 captured the far-out mood of the times.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Suddenly, everything from pop music to product design had a space-age theme, and science fiction briefly became part of everyday life.
Youth culture in the late 60s to 1970s became obsessed with futurism and with the future, with songs like David Bowie's Space Oddity. And this seemed to reflect a kind of optimism of the period, that the new generation were the generation of the future.
British science fiction was really exciting in the late 60s. I mean, there was this buzz that you weren't going to outer space, you were going to inner space. You know, you're exploring yourself or your culture or your mind or whatever.
British sci-fi cinema attempted to tune into the times by looking to the new wave of sci-fi writers like Michael Moorcock.
Are you riding me, man?
Not tonight, baby.
They made a film of Moorcock's The Final Programme, which is a brave thing to do because it's one of those books that is sometimes called unfilmable for good reason.
They should have listened to me, shouldn't they? I mean, when I tell them the apocalypse is on them, they bloody well ought to listen.
You get a kind of visual decadence, a kind of fascination with excess, and there's a lot of weird costumes and nudity and odd things going on. And The Final Programme's a very odd film, although not as odd as John Borman's Zardos.
The gun is good.
The gun is good.
The penis is evil.
Penises are bad, guns are good. Walking sticks are okay. Bread's quite bad for you. Oily fish is all right.
What people mostly pick up on in it is how Sean Connery looks. He's wearing this kind of red sort of nappy with these sort of shoulder straps and things. And
a look that we're still waiting for to come in.
Yeah, we're still waiting for that. And a moustache is like that, ponytail, and covered in kind of body hair. He's just got this sort of body hair all over his shoulders and his arms and his back. It's just going a little bit grey.
How did you get into the vortex? What is your purpose?
I'm just an exterminator.
And there's lots of good science fiction words in it. Vortex, that's in there. They're all in the vortex. And if it's not vortex, I think there's a tabernacle. Yeah. There's probably an oracle.
In the late 60s and early 70s, there were a few films which picked up on psychedelia and youth counterculture. Perhaps the most obscure of these is Val Guest's 1970 film Tomorrow, starring Olivia Newton-John. It's been very rarely seen since its initial release, for extremely good reasons. And it's about an alien who comes to Earth to pick up the vibes from Olivia Newton-John's band, which is going to revive his dying planet. It's complete and utter bollocks.
But of course, there was one pop star more perfectly suited to alien life. David Bowie in Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth.
It was the perfect casting for him. If he was going to do a movie, that was the one that he did. He chose the right one to do, because he was meant to be weird and thin and have no nipples.
He's supposed to be from Mars, I think. He has to come to our world because his world is dying, and there are a few shots of him on his home world with his wife and child, but really that's not where the heart of the film is. The heart of the film is his peculiar kind of Howard Hughes-like life.
I feel so bad, I've got a worried mind.
Let's talk.
I'm so lonesome all the time.
Oh, don't turn on those damn TVs. Come on, Tommy. Talk to me. I can't stand what's happening to you, whatever it is. Why don't you just tell me?
As he falls into a world of pleasure and consumerism and a world of wealth and a world of multiple media channels and access to information and access to sexual pleasures, he's lost. He's lost his family, he loses all sense of purpose, and he kind of withers away and becomes nobody. And this is a really interesting, very 70s use of science fiction motifs to suggest that actually being human is to be alien.
Don't you feel bitter about it? Everything?
Bitter? No. We'd have probably treated you the same if you'd come over to our place.
I think cinema was changing in the 70s. I think science fiction had lost a little of its stigma, so visionary directors like Stanley Kubrick and Nick Roeg sort of could wander into this genre and do something kind of new and exciting with it and kind of elevate it.
Those filmmakers began looking at the not-so-distant future here on Earth and found the outlook for Britain to be bleak.
What auteur directors are able to do is to use the genre to develop their ideas about the relationship between the individual and society, about the possibility that the future might not be a brave new thing, but something which is unpleasant and sort of mass-produced and dangerous to the human condition. And I think you see that particularly in a film like Clockwork Orange.
Go on! Do me in, you bastard cowards! We don't want to live anyway. Not in a stinking world like this.
Oh? And what's so stinking about it?
It's a stinking world because there's no law and order anymore.
The kids have taken over and they have no morals and, they'll kill people, they'll rape people, and they don't really care. They think it's really funny.
The Droogs are definitely a creation of their environment, of this sort of modernist hellhole. And it's that sort of architecture, I think, that Kubrick is suggesting that produces this violence and this lack of social cohesion.
And it was like, for a moment, oh my brothers, some great bird had flown into the milk bar. And I felt all the malanky little hairs on my plot standing endwise.
Alex is a character that does the most heinous things, but because he's played with such flirtatious relish by Malcolm McDowell, you can't help but side with him, which puts you as a viewer in a very uncomfortable position.
What did you do that for?
For being a bastard with no manners. Not the duke of an idea how to comport yourself public-wise, oh my brother.
I mean, certainly in my youth, all the press was about, kids going off the rails and drugs and theft and all that stuff. And then now it's kids going off the rails, drugs and theft. You know, there's this phase between, I think, probably 14 and 20 where boys have to go bonkers.
He'll do.
Well, fine. We could still look at C-Block.
No, that's enough. He's perfect. I want his record sent to me. This vicious young hoodlum will be transformed out of all recognition.
Thank you very much for this chance, sir.
Let's hope you make the most of it, my boy.
And how do you deal with it? I mean, do you strap someone's head down, force their eyes to be open, pump them full of drugs, show them violent films and make them vomit if they want to punch someone? It's a solution. It might be a little harsh.
In 1984, based on George Orwell's novel, the state's methods of power and control are also a little harsh.
There's always been a sort of dystopian trend in British science fiction. I mean, the big dystopias are still 1984 and Brave New World, which are British books. And I suppose that sort of pessimism has always been a part of British science fiction culture. And yet it is a slightly separate genre from, you know, aliens and rocket ships and mutants and all that fun stuff. I mean, you could hardly think of, you know, A Clockwork Orange or 1984 as fun.
If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
Oh, we love our dystopias. We can't get enough of them. Like, America's making Back to the Future, and we're going, we'll make 1984. It's really like, none of that fun.
While Brazil doffs its hat to 1984, it also throws dark humour into the dystopian mix. Director Terry Gilliam's Nightmare World is one where bureaucracy has run amok and administrative error results in wrongful arrest.
Who else knows? What? Helpman? I don't know. I only know you got the wrong man. Information Transit got the wrong man. I got the right man. The wrong man was delivered to me as the right man. I accepted him on good faith as the right man. Was I wrong?
What Brazil has that 1984 doesn't have is it's very funny, it's comic, it's inventive, and it's dark.
Don't you worry, love. We'll have everything ship-shape in a jiffy. That's it. Nothing to worry about. It's Tuttle downstairs who can worry, eh?
Tuttle? His name's Fuddle. There must be some mistake.
Mistake? We don't make mistakes. Bloody typical. They've gone back to metric without telling us.
Brazil is 1984 with laughs. It really does benefit from that. It's all about how systems don't work and the file is never in the right place and the right person has never been sent to
the system and it all bollocks up and then that's very believable. And the more you see of the world and the more you realise that that's what it's like.
Yeah, and I think that's aside from all the great performances and the amazing way that the film looks, I think that's the deep truth about it.
Lambert?
Shepperton Studios played host to British director Ridley Scott's vision of the future, where, back in space, things weren't looking too good for the crew of the Nostromo.
Alien was a watershed, much as 2001 had been, because of its introduction, what became known as body horror, into the genre.
It's clearly a science fiction film, but it's also kind of a horror film. It's a monster movie, but it's very visceral and there's a lot of gore and it's played for its frights. And that, I think, is, again, something very distinctively British.
British science fiction is that kind of mix between the extraordinary and the mundane. And in Alien, when the alien comes out, they're just having dinner and sort of joshing about. So it is that sort of sense of, okay, there's not a pub, but they're in the canteen.
Yeah.
Jonesy. Jonesy.
It was a seismic shift in how you saw spaceships and how you saw the future of things being patched together rather than all shiny and new.
Yeah. And the design of the alien itself, I think that is still being reworked in most films which require a scary alien.
Yeah.
It kind of goes back to that.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything before it that looks anything like as terrifying.
Where do you want to do this?
I'm making a decision just below the knuckle there.
Okay, stand by.
really clever, just to develop an alien gestation system that was completely convincing, and the way it defended itself with its acidic blood. And it was certainly it tapped into a lot of primal fears. The thing going over your face is just, that's clever. And then it goes inside you, down your tummy.
John Hurt is actually impregnated, and it isn't a woman, and that's why I think it is dealing with, men's fear of women and, everything to do with women. But it isn't misogynistic at all, because look at Sigourney Weaver, my God, she is the best character. You see her as a woman, with emotions, but she's also really strong, and she's also capable of saving the day, and, she also looks good in her underwear.
The success of Alien spawned several British films dealing with the subject of intergalactic impregnation.
A good counterexample to Alien is Norman Warren's film Inseminoid. But this is a much more misogynistic film, which eventually centres around a woman who becomes pregnant at work when she shouldn't, and becomes irrational and violent, kills all her colleagues, and then is punished further by giving birth to monsters. This misogynistic streak in 80s science fiction sort of reaches its pinnacle in Tobe Hooper's Life Force, in which the whole of the world is threatened by a naked space lady who comes to Earth and sucks the life force out of all men she encounters.
It's really just an excuse to have an actress take her top off and pose around and point her breasts at the camera. And when you set it against Alien, it makes you realise how sophisticated a film Alien is by comparison.
And with that, British sci-fi cinema went AWOL on a spacewalk for 20-odd years.
I think the death of British sci-fi in the 80s is purely down to Star Wars, and purely down to the budgets that we could amass at that time.
Stand by. Stand by.
It was Star Wars or nothing, really. So the only kind of science fiction we could do was cheap, and you make a virtue of it being cheap by making it a comedy.
Are you the male of the species or the female?
Male. I'm a man, definitely. A human man, part of mankind, but very definitely the male part, or parts.
Oh, shit.
We do have a very good sort of ability to laugh at ourselves and to laugh at the things we love, and I think it became de rigueur to just poke fun at it in a sort of fond way.
Save every one of us! Onward, my brave Hawkman! Let this be done forever!
The key film here is Mike Hodges' Flash Gordon. One of the things that makes it such a great movie is, unlike Star Wars just 3 years earlier, it knows you can't take this kind of stuff seriously anymore.
Oh my God. He's in the heaven.
Daddy's home.
Oh, shit. If you want to find a film in the science fiction genre that could only have been made in Britain over the last 20 years, you could look at UFO, starring Roy Chubby Brown. No other country could have produced that film.
Having reached its nadir in the late 1990s, the new century has seen something of a revival in big-screen British science fiction with films such as 28 Days Later.
The origins of 28 Days Later were that I'd met Alex Garland when we made a film together, and I said, let's do a sci-fi film, let's do something that we can deal with the reality of Britain in the future.
Hello!
He came up with this idea, which sort of, I suppose, mixed sort of John Wyndham and H.G. Wells, which were my sort of, let's do something like that, let's do something like The Time Machine, I kept saying to him, with sort of, Romero and zombie movies.
There are key moments in that movie that are genius, absolutely genius. I mean, obviously the opening sequence is brilliant. How you do that with a $1 trillion budget, I don't know, but how you do it on a small budget when you're filming it on DV is just, it's beautifully done.
You can't compete with big Hollywood films, so you have to attack it in a different way. A bicycle dispatch rider who gets knocked over, wakes up, and everybody's gone, and the world has completely changed forever, and you see it through his eyes. So you don't have to show, you know, all the bigger things.
It started as writing, and right from the beginning you knew this was different. Because it was happening in small villages, market towns. And then it wasn't on the TV anymore. It was in the street outside. It was coming through your windows. It was a virus, an infection. You didn't need a doctor to tell you that. It was the blood. Or something in the blood.
The Star Wars model, just that idea that the only way you can do science fiction is on a large canvas action blockbuster model, I don't think that applies so much nowadays.
I can't really remember when I last had any hope, because really, since women stopped being able to have babies, what's left to hope for?
Children of Men, I thought, was a brilliant film, very powerfully made, again on quite a low budget, but you wouldn't know that to look at it.
It may well have been that the reason that we didn't make science fiction is we stopped believing in the future for a while. And now I think we're starting worrying about the future again. So that's always good for science fiction. I think that's got us back into the science fiction groove.
Evidence of this sci-fi revival can also be seen on television with the overwhelming success of the new Doctor Who.
The thing about science fiction is you're creating worlds that don't exist. And that used to be very expensive. And now you see, even with science fiction TV shows like Doctor Who, you can create plausible imaginary worlds or worlds of the future without mega budgets.
Now, if you have a couple of really clever people and a really good desktop computer, you can get convincing spaceships and you can get quite good force fields.
You just have to meet the right geeks, really.
Yeah, you have to meet the right geeks.
Kaneda, Kappa, get back to the airlock now. No!
And British sci-fi's future continues to look bright with Sunshine, currently in production from the creative team behind 28 Days Later.
Everything takes place in space, everything takes place in the future. So we had to build a vast array of sets. We had to create a whole sort of CG world for the sun. Most of the spaceship itself is CG. That's been a really interesting and kind of difficult film to make because you have to create absolutely everything.
Right, this last year, there's a little bustle of activity there, which is encouraging. And what's particularly encouraging is a bunch of films that don't seem like a movement. They're not all like each other, but they are just, I suppose, accepting that science fiction is a mode of address that is worth using.
Certainly, we're getting a little bit more ambitious in this country. Finally, I think we're breaking out of our little hole and reaching for the stars a bit more.
Next tonight, the idiosyncratic delight of John Wyndham's Random Quest. New drama for BBC 4, part of Science Fiction Britannia.
I have found it impossible to carry